For this level, we're going to look at facility layouts. There are two general types of layouts, the product layout and the process layout. So let's talk about the product layout first. The product layout arranges the production resources linearly according to the progressive steps by which a product is made. In other words, if you look at the process flow diagram, which shows the steps in terms of making your good, then a product layout is going to match your process flow diagram. You're going to lay out your facility so that you can do step 1, then step 2, then step 3, all essentially in a line. So when I think about product layouts, I think, for example, about a car wash. A car wash where they wash the car for you. So in Texas, we have car washes. They essentially look like this. So here what happens is you drive up your car and then you get out and then they vacuum out the car and then the car is driven to the next station, and at the next station it is then rinsed off, and then it moves to the next station where it gets covered in soap, and then it moves to the next station where it gets rinsed off, and then it moves to the next station where it is waxed, and the last station where they're going to dry the windows. So that's what you see here in this picture. So basically the car is moving along a line, a production line, for each step in the process. In comparison, a process layout arranges production. So we're looking at arranging our production resources. And here, we're going to arrange them so that the resources are together according to similarity of function. So when I think about a process layout, I think about an emergency room at a hospital. So what happens is they move you around to where you need to be based on what you need done. And so what happens is that each location has different resources. So we might have doctor expertise or surgeon expertise in one area. We might have more administrative in another. And then the customer or the product, the work in process, is moved to the location based on what needs to be done. So let's look at each one of these in more detail, and let's look at how you would lay out your facility if you were using a product layout or a process layout. So let's start with our product layout. And so keep in mind this car wash. And so in our car wash, if we were to write out the process flow diagram, we would look at vacuuming, rinse, soap, rinse again, wax, dry. Okay, so if we're going to use a product layout, then essentially we're going to lay out the facility in the same order that you do your process diagram. So we would have our spot where we vacuum, and then rinse, and then soap, and then rinse, wax, dry. Okay. So with a product layout, you're going to divide your work into a series of tasks, and we're going to have a fixed path for material handling. So if we think about the car wash, all cars, draw my little car here, follow the same route. They go through the vacuum, the rinse, the soap, the rinse, the wax, the dry. So everything follows the same path. It's a fixed path. Now, what this allows for is it allows us to produce a large quantity of standardized goods. In the car wash, we can get lots of cars through, but it doesn't give us a lot of flexibility in terms of different types of washes. If you think, for example, about the drive-through car washes here, most of the time you have 3 choices on what can be done. And that's because it's set for a fixed process. Step 1, step 2, step 3. There's not really an ability to adapt that. So it works well if you're making a large quantity and it's highly standardized. Everybody wants the same thing. You're going to use a product layout when your demand for your product is fairly stable. There's not a lot of fluctuation, and we're just going to, keep churning out our items that we're producing. Now, the challenge we have is when it comes to a product layout, because everything is following that same fixed path, we really need to make sure that none of the equipment goes down. Because if any of the equipment goes down, so for example, if your soap machine stops working, then the problem is you can't actually get any cars through your car wash because everything follows that fixed path. So you need to do preventative maintenance. You need to make sure everything is working properly, because if it goes down, your whole production stops. So preventative maintenance becomes very important. Now, the benefit of having a product layout is that we have high labor and machine utilization. If we're going through a lot of units and they are basically standardized, large quantity, everything's following the same route, then that means all our machines and all our people are constantly working to make more units, or the car wash more cars. And so our utilization rates are really high when it comes to a product layout. We're also going to have minimal work in process inventory. So we're not going to have cars in our car wash that are covered in soap but not rinsed. Right? As soon as you enter the queue and you start through the process, you're in, you're out. You don't stop and sit and wait part way through. So there's very little work in process or partially completed inventory. You start and you go all the way to the finish. The third advantage is that it's much easier to do accounting and purchasing and inventory. If you don't have any work in process, if you just have raw materials and finished product, then doing your accounting, keeping track of how much is produced, what it's worth, ordering additional raw materials is pretty easy to keep track of. Now, the downside to a product layout is that you can have higher equipment costs. And this comes from the fact, well, if we look at our process down here, vacuum, rinse, soap, rinse, notice that we're rinsing twice. And with a product layout, we don't go back to the rinsing bay from before, we have a new rinsing bay. So because there's a step in between where we applied soap, then we're going to have one location where we rinse and then another location where we rinse the second time. So there's a higher equipment cost because if there is a repeat step in the process, you're going to have 2 separate machines that are doing it. Okay. That means there's also going to be some repetitive jobs. Right? 2 machines that are rinsing, 2 separate parts of our production where we're moving down the line, where we're rinsing twice. So instead of having it back to the same machine, same location, we have a different one. And there's inflexibility. Right? We said we can't actually give you a different order of these services. The only order you get is vacuum, rinse, soap, rinse, wax, dry. You could choose not to have one thing in that process, but you can't actually have the wax happen before the soap, for example. There's not that flexibility to change the order. It's a fixed path, and everybody follows the same steps. So in the next video, we're going to look at, once you identify that you have a product layout, then how do you do what is called assembly line balancing? That is, how do you decide how many workstations you're going to have? So if we have our facility and we divide it up into locations within our facility or workstations, which of the tasks do you assign to each location? And how do you balance those tasks so that you can meet the demand? So in the next video, we're going to look at how you do assembly line balancing.